So anyway, well, I wanted us to get here back into the Joseph story, and I picked up at the early part where he had all of these places of making his brothers mad at him for being the special child, and with his telling on him for whatever that reason was, and having his 2 dreams and being so special and so forth. But now down to the 12th verse in the 37th chapter, it says, "Now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem, and Israel," or Jacob, "said to Joseph, 'Are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem?' Or Shechem. 'Come, I will send you to them.' He answered, 'Here I am.'" Now those are important words. "Here I am, Lord, here I am," which we are supposed to recognize if we're listeners. That is the statement of a response to God's call. Here I am. And although it seems really out of place here, but the literary aspect of, the gong or the bell that's supposed to go off in our head when we hear certain words or names or places as we're reading Scripture, that's supposed to give us a signal. Something very important is happening in God's plan. Get ready. It's a sign or an anticipation. He answered, "Here I am." So he said to him, "Go now, see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring word back to me." And again Jacob or Israel setting him up to be a tattletale if his brothers are not doing well, and engendering more disfavor with his brothers. So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem, and a man found him wandering in the fields. And the man asked him, "What are you seeking?" "Well, I'm seeking my brothers," he said. "Tell me, please, where they are pasturing the flock." And the man said, "They have gone away, for I heard them say, 'Let us go down to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. Well, anyway, we'll pick up from there in a minute. So, as we hear this story, we wonder why Jacob or Israel would send his favorite special child Joseph out alone into the wilderness to find the brothers. And especially if he's wearing that impractical, cumbersome robe that he had given him. That wasn't, as I said last week, it wasn't a work garment. It was the garb of the palace, a life of lounging around in the tents, not a travel garment or a work garment. Now, if Jacob was so rich, as you remember how wealthy he was when he was coming to meet Esau, and he sent all of these animals and all of his servants and all of his family. If he had that many and had that much wealth, didn't he have at least an extra guy who could go as bodyguard with Joseph to help him and protect him out there in that wilderness? But no, he sends him alone. Now, in today's situation, if someone is wandering around looking lost, and it was probably so in Jacob Israel's world too, that's kind of like wearing a sign, "Victim. I am easy prey." If you've ever, told to go to New York City or someplace where there are huge crowds and go to foreign countries on mission trips or traveling and so forth, they tell you to be careful with your handbags and where you put your wallets and so forth. Because if you kind of wander around and you don't look like you're on the way someplace, you're like wearing a sign, "Victim, easy prey." But then, keep your eyes straight ahead. Just walk fast, get to where you're going. Don't be wandering around looking like you're lost. So we kind of can get the idea that he is inviting an attack or to be mugged or something. And it doesn't make sense, except for the storyteller, to be building the suspense for us. Now, they don't have the musical accompaniment to this story. But if you go to movies or you watch movies, when bad things are about to happen, it's not the happy, joyful kind of music that's playing. It's, the music that's very ominous of something bad is going to happen. It's not light, happy music. It gets very solemn and it makes you wonder, and then the drums start to roll that, there's getting to be ready for the big ka-shoom, something big and terrible is about to happen. So it's like someone is stalking you or getting ready to grab you. In our commentary, Professor Vaughter, in explaining how the weaving of two stories about Joseph are woven together from the different sources, the J source and the E source and some priestly elements as well, that we have a problem with the geographical setting of the story, because where we're told that Jacob and Israel and has settled or has got the tents is very, very, very far away from Shechem. But that we know that he was in the area of Shechem for a while and then moved away. But this story would make more sense if the setting of that line of the story was that they were still in the area of Shechem, so that the brothers grazing the sheep there, they wouldn't have had to go several days' journey just to graze the sheep. And therefore, sending Joseph out to check on them, it was not a whole day's journey out and back. It was just a short distance away to go see how things are going. So it's not quite as risky or dangerous if we change our understanding of the geography of that setting. He also points out that Joseph's decision to then go on down to Dothan was a foolish decision. His father had sent him just to go to a place close at hand, if we take that they're living around Shechem at that time. But he makes the decision to go deep into unknown territory alone. Well, that was Joseph's decision. And Vaughter points out that that's kind of an irony, because Joseph in the tradition, once we get to the end of the story, becomes the model, becomes the epitome of wisdom and practicality and survival. But at this point, he looks terribly foolish. He isn't wise. I mean, that's kind of foolish to put himself into harm's way with that decision to go on down to Dothan. But anyway, I found that an interesting comment, that as we just buzz right through these stories, we kind of miss out on that and don't have the longer view that sometimes shows some contrast that we might have noticed if we were listening to this story and spending all day. Instead of like we do now, we come to the worship service and we hope it's only an hour, and we hope that sermon is only 15 and not 30 minutes, and let's get in and get out and get it over with. But when we're listening for hour upon hour to these long narratives, that was the entertainment of the day. I don't know, sometimes they have these big blockbuster movies that are 3 hours or more. They have an intermission. So I imagine the storytellers had intermissions. But anyway, he had to have made that decision on his own, and it seems unwise. Vaughter also explains that most likely Joseph had been under the great protection and safety of Rachel's tent and close to his father, and so all the hate and bitterness and anger that had been building up in the brothers' hearts and minds over this few years that Joseph has been growing up and been the favorite and the special child, and then he probably didn't spend that much time alone with the brothers, and if he had before then, he might have gotten a little sense knocked into him by his brothers, and just kind of the normal give and take of siblings, and they're fighting and fussing and wrestling and whatnot. But in likelihood, in this setting, he may have been isolated from that. And so it's very easy for bitterness and anger to grow stronger when you're not in a personal relationship and interacting with the other. And it allows you in your own mind to only magnify all the negative and increase the hate. But if you're in a relationship, you can see those negative things, but you also recognize the good things, and you build a relationship in the interaction instead of this isolated and this imagining the worst case thing and building your bitterness and anger and not having it balanced by other good things. So anyway, this Vaughter suggests is the first opportunity for the brothers to deal with Joseph outside of the protection of the camp and his mother and his parents. Also, historically, it's interesting, and it also is giving evidence of this story being rooted in a real event of some degree. For Dothan was a real prosperous city, and it was on the long-established trade routes from Mesopotamia through Gilead and on down to Egypt. The Ishmaelites were traders and did use the route to bring from the east that gum and balm and resin that the text mentions to satisfy the market in Egypt, which needed those items in their worship service and in their practice of medicine, and especially in the embalming of the dead. The Midianites as well, of the Elohist strand that has Midianites mentioned, they were also Arab traders. And the deal in the Yahwist version with the Ishmaelites and the 20 pieces of silver, we understand money wasn't the chief goal. It was just getting rid of the brat, getting him out of the picture. So this Midianite version seems to be that the brothers had left Joseph in the cistern to die of thirst or hunger and exposure. Kind of the first idea, let's kill him. So they just threw him in the cistern to die while they took the robe and put blood on it and took it back to Jacob. But then he gets rescued by the Midianites who pull him out, but they don't pay for him. They just found him there. They may have been checking if there's any historicity to that part of, or this version of the story, that they may have been checking the cistern to see if it had water in it. And, here's a prisoner. Well, let's take him and sell him. We're salesmen, we're marketers. We found something, we know how to market this, because they did also practice some of the slave trade as well, which brings up the slavery issue, and it's one that the Bible Times accepted as a very natural part of their ancient culture. Now, the slavery in Bible times was not like the slavery of the American experience on our continent. In our time, slavery was equally a racial issue as well as an economic issue. I mean, if you wanted slaves to work the field as an economic issue, why did they have to be black? I mean, why? What determined that? I mean, there's Asians. There are all those poor Europeans, and they took a bunch of prisoners out of prison in order to send them to the New World to help settle the New World. I mean, they could have just as easily taken prisoners and said, we're going to let you work off your time doing slave labor, essentially, because you're prisoners and you have a life prison penalty for that murder or that robbery or whatever, and we're just going to work you over there. And so that could have been the labor force that wouldn't have been an ethnic or racial distinction, but was just an economic factor, if that was so important. But in Bible times, slavery was really a blessing to the slave. Does that make sense? Do I need to explain it? Huh? Well, that's the second one I'll come up with. The first one is most of the slaves were captured in war, and usually you just executed them. Remember the thing about Rome and the gladiators? Well, gladiators basically, instead of just killing them outright, will let them fight each other and kill each other as entertainment. But basically, they're just to be eliminated by killing them. But if you do not do that and make them slaves, that's a blessing to the slave because they live. And they have an opportunity to be free. One, they're smart and strong enough. You can run away. When you have a chance, you can escape. Or, these different battles back and forth. This guy conquered us. I'm this guy's slave. A little time goes on. Now he's getting in a fight with somebody else. This time, he's going to lose. And if I can lead an uprising of the slaves to help the other guy win against my master, maybe I'll be rewarded. Now, so these kinds of things can, it's a blessing in that context instead of a huge curse. Well, let's see. But a lot of times when we're just dealing with men and the warriors, that's what's going on. But we also have the captured wives and children from the conquered city. Now remember the story of the rape of Dinah and the sack of Shechem, the city. The men were all killed, but the women and children were taken. And they taken as what? Well, most likely slaves and servants or concubines, but they weren't set free and made a part of the new community immediately. So the alternative to slavery was usually execution or slaughter. And if not killed, then slavery meant you get to live and you still have a future. Now, in Israelite law, it made it a capital offense for anyone to forcibly enslave a fellow Israelite. Now, that rule came about not during the patriarch time, but later as the nation developed. But the readers and listeners knew this, that this was not the right thing to do, to enslave one of your own. But if you were going to do it, for whatever reason, you would kidnap one of your own and then ship them off to another country to be a slave. But you couldn't enslave them within your own community. That was not acceptable. But that's what happened to Joseph. He's kidnapped, he's sold, he's sent off. Another form of slavery that was criticized by the prophets very severely came about when poor Israelites were not forced into slavery by someone, capturing them, but economic conditions kind of forced them into slavery, as you were saying, for food, just to survive. If there was a bad year weather-wise and the crops failed for the poor who just were subsistence farmers, then they and their family were starving. And so sometimes they would sell one of the children, usually a daughter, in order to get some income to buy food to keep the family alive. Sometimes an adult would sell himself or herself in order to survive and provide for children. And so we had that kind of slavery that was going on. But a lot of times that kind of slavery didn't mean that you were rounded up and taken in or taken away from your community or your country and having to be housed and fed by the slave master. If it was taking place within your own community, you might still live in your own hovel or shack somewhere and then just report for duty at the master's place. Because, they could find you. It's kind of hard to run away. If you're poor and don't have any money, you're kind of stuck where you are. And that was the case in many places. To a certain extent, that was the serfdom in Europe. Before and moving into the medieval period, the lord, whoever owns the land, owns the serfs. They're tied to the land. And so the serfs have their own plot in their own little village, and sometimes they had community gardens. But anyway, the master of the manor, the lord of the manor, had his fields and his either lumber or farming, and the serfs owed so many days a week to work in the master's fields. And the kind of reciprocal relationship is the master with his knights and his army protected them from the hoarder or from the marauders who would come and try to steal and pillage and so forth. And if they were threatened, then they'd all gather in the castle and so forth. But it was virtual slavery in the sense that they were tied to the land. The Lord owned the land, owned the serfs, but it was not the kind of brutal slavery of capturing Africans and bringing them to America and taking them entirely away from their home and their culture. You just lived there, and whoever conquered the land owned you. And so that would pass back and forth. But sometimes it's remained peaceful over long periods of time, but you were still a serf, belonged to the land, and owed the master service. Now, when the Europeans came to the new land that we call America today, they really often had this same idea. And they were going to conquer the native inhabitants of the New World and turn them into this serfdom, slavery kind of position. And they were going to have to work the fields as they established their agriculture. Now, it didn't work out very well with Native Americans for several reasons. The first one was the Europeans brought so many diseases that Native Americans didn't have any immunity built up, and almost 90% of Native Americans died from the European diseases. So their numbers were decimated, and so even if the Europeans conquered, they didn't have enough workers to clear the land and do the great agricultural development they had in mind. A second aspect of why Native Americans wouldn't work too well, they were not serfs belonging to the land with established villages for decades and centuries and developing an agriculture. They're mostly hunters and gatherers. And so they would move a lot from place to place seasonally, following the herds and following the game and so forth. They did have regions that they controlled, but it wasn't like our settled kind of culture. So if you're going to try to make Native Americans serfs, you would have to change their whole culture and way of life. and that was very hard to do. Also, the rhythms of life were much different in this wild American scene. The third way, the Native Americans weren't, as I said, tied to one spot. They had their territories, but they could easily move. We have the teepees, and we know that with lots of Plains Indians, but even in the eastern part where they built lodges and so forth, they could, and often would decide to move because of one reason or another and go to another area. So you couldn't, if we think of our terms, if well established, if you got the castle, that if someone conquered your area, you couldn't just pick up the castle in the night, or when the Lord or Master went away for a few weeks, just pick it up and move it away to somewhere else. You're stuck. You were stuck there. But then African American slaves then were used in place of enslaving the conquered Indians, and that was part of why that came about, because the mindset and the vision of the Europeans for settling the New World was based upon the model of the Old World, and this whole concept of serfdom, instead of the economy that we have today where everybody gets an education or learns a skill, we have wage scales for what you pay people to do to work for you. That system was, you didn't pay people. You had these arrangements of lord and serf relationships where people belonged to the land. They weren't free to go where the work was. That whole concept was tried to put it in place in America, and since Native Americans didn't work to be the serfs, well, where are we going to get serfs? Well, let's ship them in from somewhere else. And so that was one of the driving aspects of that development. Anybody aware of that? Read that in history or analysis? Can't remember where I read that, but I thought, oh my gosh, that makes so much sense. Because somebody was deciding this is the way they're going to do it. And then there are other dynamics with the rum and the sugar and so forth. But anyway, now we have two different brothers mentioned in the two different strains of the story as we move ahead. And we need to move ahead. Let's see. Where was I? Where did I leave off? 12 to 18. Yeah, here we are. At man found him, and he wandering in the fields, and then he goes off to Dothan to find his brothers, and then he's on the way, and they said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we shall say that a wild animal has devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams." But when Reuben heard it, he delivered him out of their hands, saying, "Let us not take his life." Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood. Throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but lay no hand on him, that he, Reuben, might rescue him out of their hand and restore him to his father." So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the long robe with sleeves, or the multicolored robe, if you read the old translations, that he wore, and they took him and threw him into the pit. The pit was empty, and there was no water in it, so he didn't drown. And then they sat down to eat. And looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, with their camels carrying gum, balm, and resin, on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, again, a different brother rescuing him from, he says, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. for he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers agreed. So here we're talking about Ishmaelites, and they're getting ready. They made the deal. But then, when some Midianite traders passed by, they drew Joseph up, lifting him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they took Joseph to Egypt. So we've got Reuben and Judah trying to help Joseph not be killed. Now, when Reuben returned to the pit, and we wonder, where was Reuben? Why wasn't he with these guys when all of this was happening? But Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, and he tore his clothes. He returned to his brothers, and he said, "The boy is gone, and where can I turn?" And then he took Joseph's robe, and then they took his robe, slaughtered a goat, dipped the robe in the blood, and they had the long robe with the sleeves taken to their father, and they said, "This we have found. See now, whether it is your son's robe or not." He recognized it, and he said, "It is my son's robe. A wild animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces." And then Jacob tore his garments and put on sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and all his daughters, and again, we don't know where the daughters came from. It may be daughters-in-law, or it just may be that there were girls born along the way, but they weren't important to the story earlier, and they just happened to have slipped in here. But he refused to be comforted and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son in mourning. I will continue to mourn until I die," is what he's saying. Thus his father bewailed him. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of the Pharaoh officials, the captain of the guard. So we've got the Midianites actually delivered him down to Egypt in that part of the story. So we've got two different brothers being mentioned as speaking up and saving Joseph from death. The first is Reuben, who is the firstborn of Leah, and he argues with the others not to kill Joseph and only throw him into a dry cistern. Now, the idea given that Reuben would rescue Joseph and restore him to his father Jacob raises a question: why? What motivation would have drawn Reuben to step aside from the other brothers and act differently? No, all the brothers didn't have same mother. No. Reuben is Leah's first son, and he's the firstborn child. Rachel was barren for so long, and finally she has a child, and it's Joseph. And then a little later she has Benjamin. But there's confusion about that birth. Earlier we hear that she dies in childbirth with Benjamin, and that has already happened. But then when Joseph is telling about his dreams, that a dream of the star and the moon, and they will bow down to him. Star means Jacob father, moon means Rachel mother. Well, if he's talking, and then Jacob says, well, when he's chastising him, "Are your mother and I going to bow down to you?" Well, for that dialogue and that to be said implies Rachel has not died yet. So Benjamin is not born yet. So the different strains, we are used to a tightly woven story that doesn't have these loose ends hanging out where things don't connect properly. And so, anyway, and editors can go in and catch those mistakes and correct them. Although if you see interesting things in movies sometimes where the editors didn't catch something, it's, what was it, in Downton Abbey, they had some picture where somebody had left a water bottle on the mantle. It's a water bottle from today, but the story's back in the 40s, or And so anyway, things like that today get erased and corrected and synchronized and so forth. But these ancient stories, they didn't do that. And as I had said, a lot of times they looked at the stories they were editing and working on as sacred texts, even though they would be in conflict, and felt like it was disrespectful to try to cut things out. So they just put it all in there.
This is silver with Mennonite, not brass.
Yeah, I mean, it's all confusing when they try to blend the stories of where they cut and splice. So, yeah, if in one story they're handing the 20 pieces of silver to the brothers, and then the rest of the story has them receive it, but if you cut it off at that point and then you bring in Midianites, then all of a sudden they're receiving the money, and it's confusing. And if we kind of have to, if we really want to get it straight, we have to separate the storylines. And I've done that earlier in some of these passages, would read the Yahwist version without the priestly insertions, and we get a much more natural flow of the story, and then read the priestly version without the Yahwist insertions, and it's a more reasonable flow of the story. But when they combine them, it's confusing. Yes, that's one of the right. Get back in Jacob's good favor by doing this. That's one of the suggestions that I raised that could have been the case with him. Another one would be he was the firstborn son, and he was most likely to succeed as head of the clan if the natural course of things would take place. But this favorite son of the favorite wife, already wearing a royal supervisor's robe, indicating that Jacob Israel may be giving Joseph the birthright and the blessing that is so important. And Reuben, really more than the rest, could justify hate and despising Joseph. And he could have stepped back and just let the other brothers work out their plan. His hands would be clean. I wasn't a part of that. And he does seem to be, he's not there and then he's back and so forth. So he's got a little bit of distance, and he could have gone ahead and operated that way. But if we look at it another way, being the oldest, and this plan of the others is cooked up, they may have presented it to their oldest brother to get his approval. Because being the eldest, he was probably in charge of a lot of things. And if that's how things played out, which would mean he wouldn't be an outsider, but he'd be an insider on the deal, and he either gives his blessing on the plan and then is a part of it, or he takes charge and he changes the course of the plan as he did. Now, this reality reminded me of political intrigue. There's this big deal still floating around about Governor Christie and the Washington Bridge issue in New York City. And this is the same kind of deal. His subordinates cooked up the plan to punish a political enemy and someone they didn't like. Now, the question that's still floating out there, and we haven't had definitive proof otherwise yet, it's still gray area, was that plan presented to Christie for his approval? Did he give his blessing? Which would mean obviously he would have known, and if he knew, he didn't change the plan and send it and correct it to something else. The plan played out. Now, We don't know, but that's the issue and the question that's kind of similar to this biblical story. Were the brothers presenting the plan to Reuben for his blessing, and he didn't give the blessing on the plan as it was, but he took charge and he corrected it to try to save the negative events or direct it in a safer way. We've got the Watergate break-in where Nixon's subordinates presented a plan to him, and we know he did give his blessing, and he was in on it, and his hands were dirty, and it was discovered, and so we know how that one played out. But Reuben could have really wanted to restore his position and good graces with his dad after the Bilhah scandal, or he could have been filling a kind of surrogate father role with the younger brothers. Now we know Jacob had favorites and he wasn't that engaged with his sons and the raising of them, especially when Joseph came along. And Reuben, being the eldest, may have taken on a surrogate father role for the younger brothers and children. And if he had been doing that for a long time, it's possible that his spirit within him was moved. We can't do that to one of our own. And so the words of Judah that come out later, he's our flesh and blood, may be really the feeling of Reuben as he steps in and tries to take leadership and change the dynamic away from homicide. So anyway, they sit down to their meal, and the caravan of Ishmaelites come by, and then Judah, in the discussion, comes up with this bright idea, well, let's sell him and not kill him. And Judah is also a son of Leah. He was like third or fourth after Reuben. But Judah is also the name of the tribe that is going to take leadership. It's the southern tribe. The Israel northern kingdom dies off, but the Judah tribe is the tribe that survives. So there's reason in the storytelling to insert Judah in there as a good guy. So he speaks moral reasoning. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh. So he is sold for the 20 pieces of silver. Now, we don't know what value that 20 pieces of silver had then. It was significant, but were they like dimes or like silver dollars? Was it a heavy piece of silver or just a little piece of silver? So, we don't know exactly. But we do know that now 20 pieces of silver becomes a symbol for betrayal, for selling out someone that you love and care for and should be giving your life to protect. Instead, you sell out for 20 pieces of silver. Are there any other 20 pieces of silver stories in our Bible? No, 20. I think it's 20. Was it 30? Well, we need to look, because my mind just jumped. Somebody find that, because it's the same. Well, pieces of silver, a number with a 0 after it. So, there's a lesson there. Do not assume you remember things right. Always check to make sure you're remembering correctly. So, anyway, if y'all come up with 30, I've got to cross all of that out. Well, sorry, I was working late last night. I had 2 funerals this week and had to preach last week and all of that, and I was... Yeah, it's still a symbol for selling out and betrayal. Now, the Ishmaelites didn't actually carry Joseph down, but the Midianites pull him out, and then they take him down to Egypt, and they sell him to Potiphar. Oh, yeah, I found it there. I was checking on the 30. Is it 30 or 20 that Judas got? Okay, you found it? Okay, 30. Well, shoot, I need to be more careful. But thank you for catching me. Thank you for catching me. Yes. See, if y'all just sit there and never speak back, we would be led no telling into what kind of ditch of big problems. Oh, yeah, it's inflationary. That's right. It's the same amount. It just was inflated. It was same value in different weight, and I bet you they were polished much nicer and had a better stamp on them and all of that. Anyway, so we get to Joseph gone. Reuben comes back, and he finds Joseph gone, and he is so distraught. And we have this tearing of the clothing as a very common expression of grief in Bible times. And putting on sackcloth and ashes is also a way of grieving. Now, Jacob's mourning is so great, sons and daughters are not able to soothe him. And it's interesting that there's no mention of Rachel's grief, so this part of the grieving process probably is after she has died in this storyline. And it doesn't mention her being there. It doesn't mention Jacob trying to console Rachel, who would have lost a son. It doesn't mention Leah trying to comfort him. And it doesn't mention Bilhah or Zilpah offering any consolation. Nor does it mention their grieving. They're just not mentioned. So it leaves some open questions.